Welcome to the Microburbs podcast, where we bring suburb data to life. Learn from top industry experts, the best places to live, invest and grow. And now on with the show. Hello, welcome to the Microburbs podcast. This is number 2. I am joined with a good friend of mine, Mr. Kent Lardner, a real estate expert of many years. He's built valuation models, so he's worked out the value of individual properties. He does a lot of forecasting. He's very well known around the media traps. Lots of PR, Australian Financial Review, among other sources. And today I have got him in his home territory of Newcastle to talk all about Newcastle itself. Thank you very much for joining me, Kent.
Hello, Luke. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. So full disclosure here, I am also from Newcastle. So this is I don't know how many people have heard this term before, but two Novocastrians talking about their hometown. But also full disclosure, I left when I was 5 years old. So I'm for lived experience in Newcastle and also a lot of the data, I will defer to the expertise of the guy who has... You weren't born in Newcastle, were you?
No, I'm a Sydney boy. So I grew up out as a household kid in the western suburbs of Sydney, and then moved to the eastern suburbs, and then we went to Balmain, and then we packed up and moved up here when our first child was born. So we've been up here about 16 years now. But we bought a property up here just as a speculative investment property, I'd say around 24 years ago now.
Okay, so Balmain 16 years ago was a trendy suburb already. It wasn't the working class Balmain boys don't cry.
Yeah, it was already all of that. It had a significant surge after the GFC. We got out not for any other reason that we just wanted a change of lifestyle, just so my wife didn't have to worry about rushing back to work. So
you massively preempt the great move to regionals. You're ahead of your time.
Yes, early adopter.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, perhaps you could describe, how was my introduction for you? What would you add to that? How would you describe yourself?
Yeah, so I have been working from home for quite a long time, but spending long stints midweek in Sydney. So that whole commutable lifestyle type location thing was a familiar term for me, because I was doing that. So I was living in Sydney during the week, working for a company called CoreLogic. I've had long stints just working from home as well. So before Zoom there was Skype, and I've been using that for quite some time. So this new Zoom era is not exactly a new thing for a lot of people like me.
Very good. Yeah, so how did you find the move? So for our national audience, Balmain is an inner city, trendy sort of suburb. It's very gentrified. It's got terraces that used to be held by the landed gentry and some working class. And, it's a very funky suburb that the sort of suburb that may be associated in some people's minds with Melbourne. And then the move to Newcastle. So what was that like for you?
It was a lot easier than what we thought. There are a number of suburbs in Newcastle in close to the city. For example, I'll pick on a place called Cook's Hill, and we'll talk about that today. Cook's Hill looks, feels, everything about it is very similar to Balmain. The architecture almost the same, proximity to the city, hipster vibe, and it's been like that for 20 odd years. So if you missed that Balmain inner west vibe, you could have moved straight from a Balmain or an Annandale or any of those inner city suburbs and gotten every bit of that in a place called Cook's Hill up here. I'd argue that Newcastle is Sydney minus 30 years in many ways. The traffic's starting to build up. So we're seeing congestion, but also a bit of a change in profile. We're seeing it. I'm seeing quite a different persona of people. So as new migrants move into the place, we're seeing that similar mix to what you have in Sydney, which I think is great. It's just a mixed bag. But I remember back in the day, if you go back say 40 or 50 years, Newcastle was used as a test bed for a lot of marketing because it had a mixture of all the demographics. So all the ages, all the incomes, different classes. So they did a lot of test marketing here. And then if the product or the test marketing exercise failed, you could kind of switch it off, move on, and that's okay. But yeah, it was often used for that reason. So that resonates with me. And one of the reasons why I purchased here was that I worked in mortgage insurance a long time ago, late 90s through the early 2000s. And the cleanest LMI book or mortgage books with the lowest amount of claims were the three lenders up here. So we had Maitland Mutual, Newcastle Permanent, and Greater Building Society. And they were phenomenally clean books, very low claims ratios. And that stood out to me as an interesting reason to look at an area from an investment perspective. So I looked at it purely from that viewpoint as a speculative investment property. And then we ended up moving here.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So why do you think it was that so when you say clean investment book, you mean that people are keeping up with their repayments?
Yeah, no claims, hardly any claims. So it was the lowest claims ratio in the country between the three of them. So that told me a few things, that it was a rather conservative place. I think a lot of the people that owned here doubled down on their mortgages. They were fairly conservative types. They weren't, over the top elaborate with expensive cars or whatnot. So I think its background is a bit of a working class place, but they've all paid their mortgages and done a good job. And I think what's happened now is a lot of people have ended up with 2 or 3 properties handed down to them or bought from 30 years ago, and they bought at a low price and they've seen those prices go up. But what I'd probably say is the most important variable still is there's a high proportion of very small mortgages. So you've got a just slight above average for fully owned, but you've still got a lot of, you've got a very high proportion of smaller mortgages. And I think for a lot of areas around the country, you want a high proportion of fully owned and a high proportion of small mortgages in the current state that we're in, where interest rates are on the rise. So if you haven't had a flurry of brand new mortgages, of high LVR mortgages in an area like a Newcastle, it's going to perform a lot better in a tough time like now.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You've got a sort of grounded working class. People have been there for a while, and then you've got new people coming in, and some work that we did on mortgage stress, and you might have seen the same, that often these higher end brand name sort of suburbs like Mossman, they can end up with quite high mortgage stress. And I guess if you're buying into a high status kind of suburb, you might have a desire for other high status items, whereas a more like, typical Australia kind of city like Newcastle, maybe even the new people coming in don't have as high mortgage stress, would you say?
Yes, there's still obviously going to be cases where people have come in and they stretch themselves, which has been the case for a long time. I think the new norm is spend everything you can possibly get, borrow all you can, and buy as high as you possibly can. That's kind of seems to be the new motto, but I don't think that's always been the case, certainly for places like Newcastle, where I think a lot of people are quite comfortable living within their means. And that conservative approach, I think, has flowed on to mortgage books and low mortgage claims. But you're picking on, say, the eastern suburbs of Sydney, as you referenced there, or a Mossman or a Double Bay or whatnot. What stands out for those areas for me is the very high proportion of fully owned. So you got the old money that interest rates only help, or higher interest rates only help them. Whereas I think obviously the mortgage stress is limited to those who have bought in and around the last peak. And that seems to be the issue. So I think a lot of people come in, stretch themselves to live in a prestigious suburb, but probably haven't allowed for that 3% buffer.
It's quite hard to transition from new money to old money. To go from high income to high wealth, it's not a one-to-one relationship.
No. I'd love to know what it's like to be in part of old money, but wouldn't have a clue. I'd like to know what it's like to be with new money too.
Well, Kent, when we get our enormous exits, I'm sure you and I will be sitting on on each. We'll have our own massive cruiser.
There we go. We'll tie them up next
alongside
week.
each other, and we'll reminisce on this conversation.
That's good.
Yeah, and so Newcastle is, as I understand it, the most populous non-capital city in Australia. And there's a pattern, I understand, in the US that we copy where you have one major capital per state and then a satellite city. And then it goes down greatly from there. So Melbourne has Geelong, Sydney has Newcastle, and every city, every other satellite is much smaller than that.
Yeah, I look at the Central Coast and it's just an extension of suburbs of, the northern beaches of Sydney or, the North Shore. Yes, there's a town centre, but it's not really, I wouldn't class it as a city centre, whereas you've got a bona fide city in Newcastle, you've got a proper harbour here as well. I saw a lot of similarity when I was travelling to San Diego. I went to a few Mortgage Banker Association conferences over there, and it really dawned on me how similar Newcastle was to Sydney as San Diego was to LA. And a lot of people didn't want to live in LA, but were really comfortable and liked the lifestyle of San Diego. And when you add to it a harbour, you add to it a big military base. It's an energy centre. So I think San Diego is probably a sister city without knowing it.
What are your thoughts on, so a big thing is to define what is a city and what's the end of a city. One way of defining it is whether you can commute to it. So there are lots of tradies on the Central Coast. So the Central Coast for our national audience is a city that is in between Sydney and Newcastle. It's very long. It goes along the coast. So you have a lot of tradies that will actually commute to Sydney and others. Newcastle is quite a train ride, so some do it, but you're getting more to, once you're like 1 or 2 hours away from the city, you're getting more to being your own economy, your own nexus. What are your thoughts on how you define that?
Yeah, absolutely. With the Six Cities Commission, they're identifying the Illawarra and Newcastle as part of that broader Sydney network, but that will only truly work with a train that's probably sub 1.5 hours. So I don't see that plan coming to fruition without a faster train. It doesn't need to be a 30-minute train, just something that's faster than a car, when you're getting up. And I used to drive down there at 3:30 a.m., and I'd be down there waiting for the cafe to open before 6. That way I could beat all the traffic and the maniacs. And be sitting in there ready to go into the CoreLogic office. So I think the train link is essential for this to be attached to Sydney, without a doubt. At the moment, very much it's its own independent city. There are some people that commute, but the trains are not robust or reliable. It's not an enjoyable commute whatsoever. So, until it's an enjoyable sub 1.5 hour commute, you wouldn't want to do it.
They actually took the train out of the CBD of Newcastle, didn't they? They closed it, so you had to take the train from a suburban station.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there's two schools of thought here, and I'm probably on the lefty side, in that the heavy rail travelled all the way through and did create a rather significant barrier between the city and the harbour. So the argument for the removal of the heavy rail line and replacing it with light rail was that it would remove the barrier and open up the city and join the harbour. And it has done that. There's other people that said this is really only a sceptical perspective of effectively opening up land that is suitable to high-rise. And so if you look at Newcastle and you look at the maps for mine subsidence, pretty much, I'm generalising here, but it follows the heavy rail line all the way through. So you go, all the way out to the harbour, and then all the way through to a few of the suburbs that run up behind me. My street is the boundary, and I'm in a suburb about 5k out of the city. My street is the boundary of where the mine subsidence ends, and then the mining subsidence starts on the other side. So effectively, you have to really be in the non-mine subsidence area to build these medium high-rise without a lot of expensive remediation. So the cynic would say it was done for the benefit of developers because it terminates at a place called Wickham, and then you jump off that and you jump onto a light rail, a lovely light rail. But it's giving you no extra network. It's giving you no real ability to go that much further. It's probably an extra 500 metres a line maximum going up closer to Nobby's Beach. So in reality, until that light rail becomes a network of, say, 10 kilometres, or until that light rail extends and follows some of the old tram tracks that used to meander through all the suburbs. Don't get me started how crazy we all were when we embraced cars as the solution to everything and got rid of the trams. But if we had a true light rail network that meandered through the main suburbs, went to the main Westfield, went to the university, went to the hospital, then you could say, yes, it's a good project. So until that time, I'll maintain my cynicism. Once that network expands, I'll take it all back.
One thing that really stands out for me about Newcastle is how compact it is when you're around the city. So that you've got a CBD and right on a beautiful beach. So that is not something that you get in Brisbane for a long way. You can see the patterns of land value per square meter in cities like Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, is that you have the value per square meter goes up again around the major beaches, the nearest beaches near there. So you end up having like these stretched out cores, whereas thinking from a livability point of view, in particular with Newcastle, you've got your CBD, you've got beautiful beaches right on the CBD, and you've got this Newtown kind of area, this funky area, which is very close as well, all within a short distance, perhaps a tram ride or a walk.
Walking distance, absolutely. So if you think about it, it's a small scale version of any city, but it's a proper city. So you could imagine having George Street and Bondi within 500 metres of one another. That's what you've really got, is you've got a city with a CBD. Now, after the earthquake, it was really run down. It was void. So a dilapidated city for a long time. And that's only just starting to truly come alive again. And that's on the back of a lot of buildings like the old David Jones buildings, etc., being converted to resi, with the bottom floor being retail. And I think it needs a lot more apartments for it to truly come alive, and that's happening, and that's working. So I'd probably say, I would argue, the high-rise developments in the city of Newcastle, in the heart of it, really make sense because it's bringing life back into the place. And the only thing that you'd ask the question is, are there enough car spaces, and is the transport network good enough to sustain those people who want to get out of the city and go and visit the Westfield or go somewhere? And if they're car dependent, which many are, there's a shortage of car spaces. So that's the only downside to what's happening in and around Newcastle is, if there was a light rail network, if the ability for people to buy a unit and live in a unit in the city allowed them to do that without having cars, or a lot of cars, or 2 cars per unit type thing, fantastic place to live.
Yeah. So, there is research, I understand, that when the light rail goes in, the prices go up. So I can imagine, from the point of view of a buyer, if you see that there has been billions of dollars worth of investment, to actually lay the tracks, that reinforces that, hey, these guys are serious about infrastructure for this area, in a way that a bus might also do the job. You could have a segregated busway, it'll carry fewer passengers, but it doesn't provide that confidence for home buyers and investors.
There's a good video by Vox, VOX, on the whole thing of light rail, and that they opened my eyes to that cynical view that if it's less than a certain amount of miles or kilometres, it's not really for anyone other than developers. So if you put in a light rail and it only goes a few kilometres, the ultimate beneficiary is a property developer. As soon as it gets above, say, and I'm paraphrasing here, I think it's about 8 kilometres. Once it gets above 8K, it turns into a proper transport network, and everyone starts to benefit.
So there is a light rail already in Newcastle. How is it performing?
I think it's been great. Well, I don't think we've been plagued with some of the problems that the Sydney one has been plagued with. I think some of the trains have had some fractures in their frames or something to that effect. I don't think that we've had those problems, but it doesn't need to go high speed around big corners yet, so it hasn't really had that stress test. I like it. It's lovely to travel on. I just want more of it. I'd like it to go all the way through to the stadium. I'd like it to go all the way out to the hospital. I'd like it to take a third of the cars off the roads here, because the place is starting to feel like Sydney, maybe Sydney minus 30 years.
Sure. Yeah. I wonder, so having spent some time in Newcastle and seeing it change, I have gone back since I was 5. I'm not relying on my infant memory here. So I've seen that you've got this promenade coming up. So you can cycle it, you can walk it. You've got beautiful. So this is, if you're facing the ocean, this is on the left. Over the way is Stockton, if I remember rightly, and it's a ferry across.
It is, yeah.
And you've got tidal breaks, you've got rocks and things. I wonder, what does the vision look like for Newcastle in 50 years? Does that change?
I think a lot of Sydney-siders have been looking at a place called Carrington and saying this is the next Balmain. So if you look at what Balmain was, say, 100 years ago, heavy industry, contaminants, etc. And it's almost exactly the same as a suburb called Carrington, which is feels like it's kind of the same in every way. So Carrington, certainly. Stockton, there's a bridge there, but you need to really, it's a 20-25 minute drive from the city in and around the suburbs and out through an industrial place, a road called Industrial Drive, and to get out to Stockton. So Stockton's a bit of a lifestyle location, but yes, you can catch the ferry across. Interesting, just a side note, I noticed a number of resales, a number of short, owned for a very short period of time. So properties that were purchased in the last 3 years that have relisted in Stockton. It came up on a map. I produced a map a few weeks ago for News Limited, and we looked at some of these locations where there were repeat sales, and Stockton came up, so that was interesting. I would argue that the biggest transformation for the area might be not probably 40 years, but probably 10 years away, in the form of the first one being a bypass that's underway, that's going behind the hospital. And there's a big roundabout called the Jesmond roundabout, and a lot of traffic flows through that and then up to a road that is called a few different names. The main one is called, say, Lookout Road, and that runs up along the side of the hospital and splits a number of suburbs. With the traffic moving from that road out to the bypass, that's going to have a significant impact on a lot of Newcastle. So I think that bypass is the first thing. The second big thing I see happening is something called Hunter Park. Now, if you look at the New South Wales government, what they listed down as some of their priorities for new housing, Hunter Park was their number one project. Now, I've got a video for it, but we'll just talk to it for now. So Hunter Park is effectively a new suburb designed in and around the stadium. So if anyone has driven into Newcastle and is aware of where the football stadium is, so if you watch the Newcastle Knights on TV, or if you zoom in on, I think it's called McDonald Jones Stadium now. If you zoom in on McDonald Jones Stadium on Google Maps, behind it is a lot of land. So there's a showground, there's a bit of industry and whatnot. That whole area is looking to be rezoned or has been rezoned. I'm not too sure if it's happened just yet. And the plan is, and there's some beautiful plans, is to effectively have that as a sports tourism precinct. So it'll have a mixture of high-rise hotels and an aquatic centre and a number of new residential medium high-rise buildings as well. And now that could be a fantastic thing for the whole of the Hunter region, because I think if sports tourism, for example, becomes a mainstay of the area, then you could have people coming in from all over, including Sydney, to a lot of events as well. It'll have eateries and all of that. So I think it could become the lifestyle hub for the whole of Newcastle and surrounds. What would make it work very well is if that light rail extends to it and reduces a lot of the traffic load that will follow.
Interesting. Yeah, so on your point of turnover of housing that you saw in Stockton, I saw on Microburbs the retention around the promontories in Middle Harbour was much greater. So this notion of the tightly held area. So that definitely some analysis that I would love to do at Microburbs is to look at the drivers of this retention. Particularly interesting would be if it has new migrants coming in and yet it's still maintained. So there's places like Lakemba that have new Muslim migrants, new waves of Muslim migrants come in and out. So at the moment it's the Bangladeshis, before it might have been the Syrians, etc. So I'm interested in retention overall, and also how has it changed in the post-COVID era? So what is that move looking like as people are, maybe people's conception of what a city is can grow if they only have to be in the office 3 days a week versus 5. So what is happening as people move out to new entrants into more far out places? What kinds of people are able to stay, and who ends up having to go back to the big city?
Are you talking Newcastle as the big city or Sydney as the big city?
Sydney is the big city.
Yeah.
So excuse my Sydney bias here. Obviously, Newcastle itself has its own gravity, has its own orbit. But in this case, I was talking about Sydney as the big city, as the primary source of employment.
Yeah, look, Newcastle's comfortably commutable once or twice a week to Sydney. So if you had a hybrid work arrangement and you wanted a beachside quality lifestyle location, and you wanted to, depending on your budget, you could probably buy 30 to 40% more bang for buck than you could in most of Sydney. Equally, a lot of people driven into the outer extremes of Sydney, house and land areas, etc., that are underdone for infrastructure, where you may be relying on a car and then a train. If you got up early enough, like I used to, and you were on the road by 4:30 or 5 a.m., you could be at Hornsby in an hour and a half, and then on a train and in the city in another 45. And that suddenly becomes comparable to some of these other Sydney exurbs, these extreme locations. I think for Sydney, by and large now, if you had a budget of under $1 million, you're stretched. Pretty hard to find a house. You can find townhomes. So Sydney's almost become New York in that unless you're buying a second or a third home, first home buyers are limited to apartments. That's it. Or you're buying on the outside. Whereas, excuse me, if you had a $1 million budget, you could buy a lot. You've got a lot of options in the Newcastle area.
Yeah, so the ability to have an actual freestanding home, Australian dream home, but also be close to a beach, much closer to a beach than you could ever be in a far outlying Sydney suburb, and potentially also a better art scene, so a bit more funky places nearby that is right next to the beach. So I can see there's quite a powerful lifestyle proposition with Newcastle going forward.
Yeah,
as Sydney is running out of supply, of course.
Yeah, people have been priced out, and that'll have a flow-on effect because if people can't afford to rent, you're going to struggle to find essential workers. So, police, nurses, people who work in hospitality, Sydney's becoming very uninviting, unwelcoming and unaffordable. So I probably see an exodus of those types of workers that will nourish industries and nourish cities like Newcastle.
I can definitely say from personal experience, paying for daycare in suburbs closer to the city is way, way higher because they have to attract more low-end workers. They don't want to pay much more than the minimum wage or the award. And so these poor people have to drive in from the western suburbs, so they have to pay a premium to cover that. And so that being a very labour-intensive industry, that's really at the coalface. And of course, when people are having kids, there's a time when they're particularly worried about their finances and making ends meet. That is a big consideration for can you actually support a more modest end of the workforce so that you can get the services that you need.
Yeah, and in terms of pipeline supply, you've looked at building approvals. I have. Sydney's not done a good job. There's a chronic shortage. If you were a renter, you'd rather be in Melbourne than pretty much any other capital city because it's got supply. It's got pipeline supply. It's got some vacancies, a healthy balance of vacancies. Whereas Sydney, the problems are only getting worse, and there's no end in sight no relief in sight for renters at all. So I think that the exodus that happened because of COVID is a very different chapter. I think the next chapter is a range of people who say, I'm not getting value for money here. I can't save a deposit because I'm spending 30, 40% of my income on rent. I'm out.
So tell me about funky Newcastle. This is not something, if I could be frank, it's not the first thing that comes to mind when people think about Newcastle. It may be seen as a more suburban place with nice beaches, but there has always been a strong arts community there. There are museums. They gave, when there was a glut of supply in the CBD, they handed over studios to artists, I understand. So tell me about the other Newcastle.
Yes, it's the cafe vibe, the restaurant vibe, the art scene is strong. I was pretty happy to see that we had Elton John had 2 concerts here, would you believe?
Maybe he was testing out some new material.
Well, I think test marketing.
A bit of trip hop.
Pink has just announced that she's playing concerts here as well. So I think the place is starting to stamp itself as an entertainment and arts location, without a doubt. The Van Gogh exhibition was here as well, which was the multimedia exhibition. So the suburbs that would have that true hipster vibe are definitely in the inner city. So if you look at Newcastle, the city proper, Cooks Hill, and then as you start to move out, it becomes more family-oriented suburbia. So you've got a big suburb that a lot of people are familiar with, Merriweather, and it's really split up into probably 2 or 3 sub-market groups. So you got a rather wealthy, elite housing in there close to the beach. And then as you move further back, it becomes more general suburbia because it's a very long suburb that stretches back from the beach. And then, you've just got a fairly normal, balanced range of suburbs that become your typical suburbia. So I would argue that the hipster suburbs would probably be limited to one or two in close to the city, but it might be even a little bit more than that when you start to take into account some of these workers' cottage locations. And Islington's a great example. A true, if you look up regentrification on Wikipedia, you'll probably see some pictures of Islington there. So Islington, Wickham are these, industrial workers' cottage type suburbs that have, reinvented themselves. Hamilton has kind of always had that mixed vibe, and Cooks Hill, another one, as I mentioned before, very hipster, lovely spot. And then you've got the unit market, so you still have a lot of lifestyle, but a lot of people who are retiring are choosing Newcastle and Newcastle East, so they might live in the suburbs today, but they're now planning their retirement to move into and live walking distance to the restaurants, walking distance to the beach, even though they might be 5 minutes away in the car today in a house.
So Merriweather, if I remember correctly, Silverchair was based there. You've got, so it really is a brand name suburb, like the Mossman of Newcastle, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, probably the most expensive. You get a number of the more expensive streets. I did a report called the top 100 streets or the top 50 streets of Newcastle, and you've got a couple of well-known beachside streets in and around Merriweather, but you've also got a couple of interesting streets in and around the Hill. So just between Merriweather and the city is a suburb called the Hill, and there's a beautiful park there, and it's up nice and high, and you get a lot of views. You get views over to the beaches and the ocean, but also views back over the city. And so the Hill is also another suburb that's full of rather expensive, lovely housing.
What do you think about the relationship between hilliness and affluence?
Yeah, I get it. I love it. I love the undulating areas because they're the ones that obviously give you the views.
So obviously, in suburbia, like places like North Ryde, you can have much larger houses at the top of the hill. The land's worth more, so keeping to a consistent ratio, I guess a cold-hearted way of thinking of it is keep a consistent ratio of market capitalization, build a big house because it's expensive land, because it's more high status. And it's interesting. So talk about the hilliness of Newcastle. A lot of it's flat.
Yeah, a lot of it's flat. The area that the suburbs are called, that is called Broadmeadow, was a lot bigger than what it is now. And it was called Broadmeadow for a reason. And the Aboriginals called it, had a name for it, where it was a place where you caught wallabies because it was pretty easy to see them and hunt them down. So it was this broad plain, and that's now been carved up, and I'm in one of those suburbs called New Lambton. In terms of the undulating areas, my suburb rolls up to a park, a blackbutt reserve, a big, huge green area. And
it's quite the tourist attraction.
It is. It's a lovely spot. Now, what you'll find, and this is something that sometimes you don't, would you do it? You do it every day, is once you start to overlay data on top of maps, you start to gain insights that you may not have had previously. And one of those that I've just recently uncovered was that I've been plotting the top 20 streets in each suburb on the map. And with my suburb, instantly what I noticed was the highest priced streets on average were the ones that were along the boundaries of the green. So that was bordering Blackbutt Reserve. Other spots where you'll notice this is, wherever there's a ridge lane or a ridge street, it's the ridge lines. So typically the suburbs where the ridge lines are, which are usually the highest point in those undulating areas, they're the ones with the views, and that's where you will find the more expensive streets. And classic
It'd be
example.
Interesting to do an analysis. So you've done by street by suburb, which makes perfect sense. But imagine simply by street. So if you like Flood Street, probably would be, because there's a whole lot of them, would probably on average be less across the country. Yeah. Or you could do it as a ratio to the overall suburb to make it ever more accurate. So like the Flood Street in Leichhardt.
Yeah, burnt out Commodore Street.
Station Street, what you'd think would be a pretty good performer.
Yeah. So look, it's just interesting because golf courses, it does become captain obvious when you mention it, but when you see it on a map, it reinforces it. So the streets that hug the golf course, the streets that hug the ridge lines, the streets that are adjacent to these big
Crescents, I think, would probably do pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. So that tree line. So I don't know if that answered your question, but there are a number of suburbs that have got the heights attached to them. So New Lambton Heights, it's this constant battle for who's got the highest median price because there's a bit of volatility in both suburbs. And at the moment, it looks like New Lambton's kind of pipping New Lambton Heights. But there's pockets there. If you look at New Lambton Heights as a suburb, there's a road that runs through it called Lookout Road, and it's the beach side, the eastern side of that Lookout Road is where the more expensive streets are, and they're the ones with the views back out over the ocean. So fairly obvious. Adamstown Heights is another interesting suburb. A lot of houses built, I think don't quote me exactly, I think a lot of them were built around the 50s, 60s. And I think it's the perfect suburb for knockdown rebuilds as well.
There are a lot of them there. I actually lived in Adamstown Heights, and certainly when I go for nostalgia's sake, go for a drive around there, a lot of homes built, I would say, since 1980.
Yeah,
and near the bush.
So I think it's a great spot for capturing some views from second stories if you can get the planning approval for it. My suburb at the moment's interesting. I'm in New Lambton, and I'm seeing a lot of houses selling in that 900 to 1 mil spot that are just knockdowns. They're junk build, knock them down, and they're building $500,000-$600,000 properties. There's a lot of that going on right now. So there's even to a point where there's a new home display around the corner, would you believe? So, a display home for people to walk in and pick their knockdown.
Display home for freestanding homes, not for units.
No, for freestanding homes aimed at that knockdown rebuild. We've got a friend of a family who works for McDonald Jones, and he's very, very busy in the inner suburbs of Newcastle with knockdown rebuilds.
How much stock is there in terms of freestanding homes in Newcastle? How much more can be built?
There's not a lot of greenfield. Depends on what zone you pick. So I kind of draw Newcastle into 3 zones. You've got the old city road. So anyone who's old enough before freeways and whatnot would have known that in the old days, if you're driving from Sydney to Brisbane, you'd drive up City Road and drive through Newcastle and keep going up the coast. That City Road to the east, I'd call Tier 1. That's where your Merriweather exists, where your Newcastle City exists, your Cookshill. So there's a handful of small suburbs in there, and that's got a few duplex builds here and there, but it doesn't have pretty much anything available, a little bit like your eastern suburbs of Sydney. Then you've got your Tier 2, which runs from that City Road out to Lookout Road that I mentioned. That Lookout Road is the one that runs up beside the hospital, the John Hunter Hospital. Again, there's not much there other than the infill areas, which would include that Hunter Park that I mentioned, and there'll probably be a few thousand units go in there. So I think most of your supply in that Tier 2 area has to come in the form of infill of industrial, commercial type zoned land that gets rezoned, and they build some medium high density. I think that's really the key there. There's a few areas that have been rezoned where you do get duplexes. You are getting duplexes built. So there needs to be a fair bit of rezoning for that to happen at scale. And then on the other side of Lookout Road out to the western suburbs, you do have plenty of land. And there is land in pockets that is privately owned, ready and poised to be served up as new estates, running all the way out to Maitland. So I think what you'll see is the equivalent of what Sydney saw 100 years ago with the the evolution or development of your Blacktowns and your Liverpools, and effectively whole new whole new estates and new cities. So I think Maitland's going to be a very, very large growth area, without a doubt.
Aha. Just mentioning Maitland, I feel the need to also mention Cessnock. I know about the rivalry between these two places. So how do you see the development of from the Sydney sider's point of view, Maitland and Cessnock are the satellites of the satellites.
Yes.
How do you see those places developing? And do they become cores of their own, or are they outer suburbs of the Newcastle?
I hope they get the love they deserve. I have always worried that, your Parramatta and your Liverpools and your Blacktowns, your western suburbs of Sydney were neglected, carrying 60 or 70% of the population of Sydney, yet hardly any of the infrastructure, poor cousins in every way. I hope that's not the case. I hope we don't repeat that mistake. I think that we've gone a long way. New South Wales government has gone a long way to rectifying that now, acknowledging that the western suburbs of Sydney deserves better, and it's getting that infrastructure. I hope it's not left to private enterprise and developers to deliver these things. And you all read the stories that hey, McDonald's goes in a year before the schools do. Which is still a problem in the western suburbs of Sydney. I just don't want that to be the case with people who are buying and setting up their whole future in house and land development and estates in and around Maitland, etc.
Yeah, so part of the story of Western Sydney is that these places became marginal electorates. They became battleground seats. How does it look in Newcastle and Maitland? Is it that you've got they're not so rusted onto Labor anymore? And
a lot of people gave the Libs a chance, and they blew it. So they've gone back. The rusters come back. Everyone's gone back to Labor. So I think that we might find that these will be safe Labor seats for some time to come. They did open up. They did give them a chance, and there was some untoward behaviour. And they lost the trust of the people, so they've gone back to Labor by and large.
Is this related to planning and infrastructure?
Possibly, yeah. A little bit related to brown paper bags.
Yes, right. Yes, so I'm interested if you could talk some more about the funky suburbs, Cooks Hill. And so I understand there's something like a King Street. So there's a long street. It does have cars in it. It's a bit of a strode, to use that term, a street and a road, but it is quite the hub of activity. And
Derby Street. Derby Street runs all the way from Merewether through Cooks Hill into the city, into Newcastle proper or Newcastle East, and it's a really hip vibe happening street. You've got a lot of mixture of shops, your typical cafes, but you've got some trendy pubs there that everyone likes to go to, etc. So Derby Street's hot and happening. It's certainly taken away the mantle from Hamilton. Hamilton has a street called Beaumont Street, and it seems to be it's kind of lost the vibe that it had maybe 20 years ago, and everyone's doubled down on Derby Street now.
Why do you think that is?
I can't put my finger on it. Every time I go to Beaumont Street, I do hold onto my wallet. It just doesn't have that same, it doesn't feel as safe as, say, Derby Street. And Derby Street's got a better vibe. It's closer to the population. So I think probably because you've had a lot of these units going in, it's walking distance to a lot of the people who are moving in and residing in Newcastle. You can walk to Derby Street. So I think that's probably the big driver of it. I think also a lot of businesses have found it fairly tough to keep the lights on in places like Beaumont Street. So, when you've got empty shops, it has this knock-on effect that people just don't want to go there. So it compounds the problem.
So you have all the funky kinds of amenities. So like for our hip score, we found predictors, things like tattoo parlors, gay and lesbian related organizations, obviously your funky cafes, unusual cuisines, not just your standard Thai, Chinese and Italian, but Moroccan and Nepalese, that sort of thing.
Yeah. There's another little spot called the Junction at Merriweather, and it's got a lot of interesting restaurants and cafes as well. So it's another little hub, not far from there. So that's be another spot. And you still got your strip, your shopping strips, your high streets of a couple of the inner suburbs. Lambton's got one that's just had a microbrewery approved. So I track planning alerts, and I just saw a pop up last week for a microbrewery on the main drag in Lambton. So I think when those types of things go in, it really picks up the vibe of the suburb.
Yes, I've been to. There is a pub in Newcastle. I'm sure there's many where it's like the tap house kind of thing where you can get your paddle with a selection of beers.
Yeah, grain store. I think it's
that sounds it.
Grain store. Yeah. I remember when that building came on the market about, give or take, don't quote me, I think it was about 12 years ago. And I thought this was in our budget. I could have bought that and put someone in, leased it back to the people like that. I didn't do it, but I'm full of those stories, regretful stories. It was a very affordable building, a beautiful building. Anyway.
Yeah. Although how thriving, pubs around this area, you can go on a Friday or Saturday night and they're hardly full.
It's awful now. What's it cost to buy a beer now? About $80? So
it's pretty intense.
It will hurt, hurt no matter what. So they implemented the lockout laws, and it certainly worked in terms of crime rates and whatnot. But I think probably the greater impact is going to be the cost of beer. If beer's too expensive and people are under cost of living pressures, what are they going to do? They'll sit at home and watch TV and just get a Dan Murphy's back at 20.
Yeah, so Newcastle actually was the pioneer. They did the lockout laws before Sydney. There was quite a problem of alcohol-related violence on the streets late at night.
Yep.
Lots of people, I remember going and just people would drive into town and with a case of beer and just sit around and drink. Maybe that was a response to the lockout laws. So it was very lively. The town does come alive late at night, to put it in a nice way, which is great for a lot of demographics. And then the lockout laws came into Newcastle. Can you talk about that from your perspective?
Yeah, well, it depends on who your network of friends are. So, we've got a few friends that are in the police force and doctors and nurses and whatnot. And if you come in it from the first responders perspective or the police perspective, they were very welcoming because they saw a massive drop-off in workload and violence. So, that I'm tainted by that perspective. If you come in it from the perspective of the pub owners, etc., they miss the revenue. And they're trying to get to a nice balance between the two as we speak. So I noticed on the news only a couple of weeks ago that they're doing some trials to try and loosen up that harsh lockdown. I think you can still go out after 12, but you can't enter a new premises after 12, or something to that effect is how it works. Now, it's been a long time since I've been out after 12. I'm in bed a long time before that. So I'm not really an expert on nighttime entertainment anymore.
You do keep an eye on the data, though. So I wonder, you're a daytime early riser person that gets up and looks at spreadsheets and numbers. What do you think about lockout laws and the impact on prices?
Impact on prices, that's interesting. Certainly, noisy neighbourhoods force the properties to turn over a lot more. So main streets turn over more because of noise. Living next door in a noisy pub, they turn over more because of noise. If you look at the average length of tenure for a typical house, it started to stretch out. I think it was, last time I checked, it got up to about 13 odd years. And so there's this, prolonging and pushing out. I'd probably even argue that with what's happening now, people are holding longer because they can't find another place to buy. And no matter what's happened to prices, there's not too many, a lot of suburbs that don't have high inventory levels. So the levels of choice are very limited around the country still, irrespective of the talk of prices. Now, I think by and large, what you find is you got a noisy street, noisy pub, the turnover is high. If the turnover is higher, that means prices are under downwards pressure. So, noise is not a good thing for prices. That's what the numbers say.
For residential, for commercial, could be different story. But
probably the opposite effect, yeah.
Yeah, but you're a resi guy.
I'm only resi.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I think the breadth of your resi knowledge, we're not going to run out of things to talk about anytime soon.
True.
So Sydney is a polycentric city, yeah? So you drive the experience of driving into town, you'll see groups of buildings, and then the person from outer city will say, is that the city? And say, no, that's Parramatta. Is that the city? No, that's Chatswood. No, that's Penrith, yeah? Or Concord, these new places, yeah? What do you think Newcastle will adopt this polycentric model, or would it be more like Melbourne and be very much centralised?
I think it'll stay like Melbourne because of the mine subsidence issue. It will cost too much to remediate the ground. Now, you will have one centre there that doesn't have that mine subsidence, which is the Hunter Park suburb. So you'll have a high-rise suburb there, which will be a mixture of hotels and high-rise units. So that'll be like our Chatswood. So Hunter Park will be our Chatswood, and then we'll have our city. I think that's about it, really. I don't think we'll have much else.
Yeah, so we haven't mentioned, we've got this far into a Newcastle podcast and haven't directly said that Newcastle really did start as a mining town. So it was named after Newcastle in the UK because of its prodigious coal mining output. And so you've got all of these mines. Is it really Swiss cheese in the ground there? So like Newcastle is a big city. It's laid out. Is it that there's just so many mines, or you just don't know where they're going to be? Or is it that even if they're far apart, they can pressure on them can subside? What causes this to?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert when it comes to geology, but certainly the maps are available through, if you follow the links through or do a solid Google search, and you'll find that the mining subsides. There's a couple of strips. So as I mentioned earlier, it follows, by and large, if you look at where the heavy rail is and you draw a buffer around those heavy rail lines, that's your zone where you don't have the mining subsidence. You've got a significant pocket of it in and around that Hunter Park, and you had another big strip there through to the harbour. Outside of that, it goes all the way out to Wallsend. So, and further on, and it goes down the beaches as well. So you have to assume that with the exception of a few pockets, a few strips of land, there's mining subsidence everywhere that will, in my view, restrict medium and high density.
Newcastle, of course, had, I think, the largest earthquake at least in a city in a long time. In Australia, we're not on any, for foreigners listening, we're not on any big plate. We're not New Zealand. But yeah, there was a large earthquake that was caused by these mine shafts. Is that correct?
I don't know the exact cause of it, but certainly it's interesting. You see some photos around the place, and there was an amazing hotel only around the corner here that I didn't know existed that came down. So there was a lot of heritage buildings that, effectively had to be demolished, and a lot that they retained the facade, so they had heritage status, and that's what created the problem with the city effectively dying, because it was unsafe and it was unprofitable. So the worst of both worlds, you couldn't really do much there. So that led to the stale city for a couple of decades, and that's only just starting to come into its own, because now you can argue it's profitable. So you can retain the facade, have that beautiful heritage feel, and be respectful of what the architecture was, but then build high-rise units behind it. So the life is certainly coming back into the city now, but for a long time, as a result of that earthquake, and I wasn't living here at the time, but that earthquake, hurt a lot of people, killed people, and effectively ripped the heart out of the city. But it's interesting, you talk to some of the older folk that used to travel into the city, and they say it was the done thing to come in from a Maitland on a Friday night and go to the dances in Newcastle. It was a thriving city on a Friday and a Saturday. It was the place, and we're going back in time, but quite some time back, it really must have been the hive of activity.
Yeah, right.
Sure.
Yeah, so you mentioned about New Lambton. Would you like to talk from personal experience?
My suburb.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you've got the typical golden triangle. Most of your most expensive streets are up towards that Black Butt area. So if you visit my website, I've got a list there of the top 20 streets, and you can see where they are. But by and large, it's a suburb predominantly made up of freestanding houses, workers' cottages, California bungalow styles. Typical block sizes, around about 450, 500. There are some bigger blocks, especially up in that more prestigious area. A bit of a mixed bag. You've got, I think, the number one employer in the suburb is the hospital. So you've got a lot of doctors and nurses that live here. We are going to be walking distance to that new Hunter Park when that kicks on. So, it's going to be a construction site for several years, obviously. But as a result of that, you're going to have a lot of demand from tradespeople trying to find place to rent and live during that construction phase. So I think that's going to have an immediate impact on this suburb as well. So you've got a few good things. You've also got that bypass that I mentioned earlier on. I think that's going to have a very positive impact on a number of streets that are on or near that main road that's currently carrying traffic called Lookout Road. That traffic will subdue and move to the bypass. So I think that'll have a positive impact on certain pockets through the suburb as well. In terms of the suburb itself, it's always been a bit of a mixed bag. You had a third of the properties that were renovated or new or nice. A third that were in the process of or had the potential to be renovated, and a third owned by people who just owned their property but had no money. Asset rich, cash poor. And what we're finding is that older population now are starting to move into retirement homes or pass away, and those houses are now transitioning over and becoming the knockdown rebuilds. So there's a lot of that going on here.
You mentioned before, just to jump around a little bit, if you don't mind, you mentioned before Hamilton, you needed to hold on to your wallet. Can you talk about where is safe, where and when is safe in Newcastle and for whom?
Yeah, it just depends. We've got friends who own a beautiful house, doctors that own a beautiful house in Hamilton, and 2 days ago, her car got stolen. So we've got other friends that live in Hamilton, wealthy family, and they had their work ute parked on the street and was slammed into by a drunk. So I think what you've got is pockets of substance abuse that cause these problems, and a lot of that substance abuse, unfortunately, is concentrated in a lot of the public housing estates, which is sad, right? I'm a houso kid, so I think that's the problem. These people feeling hopeless and turning to substance abuse to deal with it. I think that's the crux of it, really. If we could get on top of that, I don't have the answers to that, but that seems to be the issue. So if you're in or near the substance abuse and drugs and alcohol, that's where your problems are.
Where is the public housing in Newcastle?
It's spread out. It's spread out. Yeah, there's a big pocket of it in Hamilton. There's a few other pockets, but that's the main area. That seems to be the the hub of this activity.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing how substance abuse changes over time. So back in the 90s, it was all about heroin. So it was very much property crime to make money, just the best way of making money. They were the worst kind of hustler, I suppose. They were little entrepreneurs. And now with ICE, you have it's more of a mental health problem. So you have the crime can be a bit more crazy. They can be a bit more, they're going out on escapades, less predictable kinds of activity.
Yeah, outside of my remit, but just horrible to see.
Yeah. And what else would you like to say about Newcastle? What am I leaving out? I think this is always a good question to ask.
Yes,
what are the questions that I should have asked?
The elephant in the room is the fast train, the talk of the fast train. And it did influence me to look here. You know, it wasn't the only reason why I purchased here. But for a lot of people, they would hear the politicians over the last 30 years make big, bold claims of fast trains. And, they usually, none of them have come to fruition. Spent a few $1 million on a research report, and that's as far as it goes. I think what is most likely to happen is we will move as far as a faster train. That seems real. And I'm 50-50 on whether we will get a bona fide very fast train. The landscape between here and the other side of the Hawkesbury is just a little bit too tough. And I just don't know if we'll be able to do it. That said, there may be some technologies that emerge that make tunnelling much, much cheaper.
It is certainly beautiful going along the Hawkesbury.
Yeah, but it's slow, isn't it?
Yes.
And that beauty wears thin when you want to get home to the wife and kids, or the husband and kids.
A bit different for me just going on a day trip to Newcastle. Yeah. Other thoughts? Might cut this little bit while we think, Paula. I have this
market conditions.
Market conditions, yes. That's it. Market conditions, long-term view.
Yeah, I put together some metrics. I look at the SA3s, which I think you can explain what an SA3 is as well as anybody, but Newcastle in its own right is a statistical area 3, very similar to the local government area. And its performance has improved. So I've given it some scores. Now, I'm going to go through a number of scores for the area. These are 1 to 5 Likert scale scores that follow the same, inspired by the way valuers do their risk ratings. So effectively 1 being lowest risk, 5 being highest risk. 5-year price change, Newcastle 1. 1 month price change, Newcastle 3. Now, that's not bad. That's just average. Inventory, which is how many properties are selling on average versus how many properties are listing on average, expressed as months of stock. So if you add 2 months of stock, it's pretty low. Its inventory level, its score is 2, and its number of its inventory level is 2.19, just over 2 months of stock. So that means that if no other house listed today, from today forward in Newcastle, you'd have nothing left to sell in 2 months' time. So it's one of the tightest SA3s in the country right now. Inventory trend 1, so it's forecast to go lower. Days on market 1, very, very low risk there. Vacancy 2, low risk. Yield average 3. Rental trend, rents are still pushing up, so rental risk 1. Job concentration risk 1. Not everyone works in the mines. People have got to realise that. Fully owned 3, but the small mortgage is 1. So you've got a very, very high proportion of people here that have a mortgage of $2,500 per month or less. So in short, this is a market that's bubbled to the top of my metrics with no thumbs on the scale because I live here. It's come up to the top. So I think I had St Mary's in Western Suburbs of Sydney as number 1 as an aggregate weighted score, and I had Newcastle as number 2.
Great. Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to cover, Ken? It's been a really interesting conversation. I think people will learn a hell of a lot about Newcastle via this podcast.
Yeah. get a plug in for Suburb Trends. What I will do is I'll put up a report, and I'll target a number of suburbs that I like to look of from an investor's perspective. So I'll just create a free download report, and I'll place that on suburbtrends.com.
Yeah, absolutely. Check it out, Suburb Trends. Ken has been in the business for a very long time, and he has been looking very particularly at this SA3 level, looking at what is going to drive growth. So yes, thank you everyone for joining again for the Microburbs podcast. This was the first in hopefully a series of local area deep dives with people who really know their stuff in particular regions of Australia. Locals who have engaged with it, they have lived experience as well as working knowledge. These people who actually work with the data in these areas. So again, thank you very much, Kent, and we should do this again sometime.
Thank you, Luke.
And Kent and I have many conversations about all kinds of things. We go beyond Newcastle, so I think it's going to be well worthwhile joining up again.
Great. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. Thanks for listening to the Microburbs podcast. If you have any questions for Luke or our guest, please place them in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more great content coming soon.